Precolonial Black Africa by Cheikh Anta Diop. Chapter 4. Political Organization in Black Africa. The political organization, the principles of which we are about to consider, is the one which, give or take a few variants, seemingly govern the African states from the 1st to the 19th century. This is what we may assume from the testimony of al-Bakri and Ibn Khaldun concerning the Empire of Ghana, 10th and 11th centuries, and more recently of Batuta on the Empire of Mali, 1352-1353. Ghana, Mali, and Songhai were very shortly to become Islamized, beginning in the 10th century under the influence of the Almoravid movement. In order to come closer to historical truth, it seems necessary to take as a frame of reference, as example for study, the constitution of an African state, contemporary with these, with the parallel history, but which, because of its southern location, Burkina Faso of today, was not overrun by Islam. It will thus be possible to bring out the modifications of political structure due to external influences. Constitution. Mosai is a constitutional monarchy. The emperor, the Moro Naba, comes by heredity from the family of the previous Moro Naba, 11th century probably. But his nomination is not automatic. He is chosen by an electoral college of 4 dignitaries, presided over by the prime minister, the Togo Naba, as in Ethiopia. He is actually invested with power by the latter, who, however, is not a Nakomse, nobleman, but comes from an ordinary family, and who is, in reality, the representative of the people, of all free men, or the citizens who constitute the Mosai nation. The emperor is assisted, in addition to the prime minister, by 3 others: the Rassam Naba, the Balum Naba, and the Kidaranga Naba. Each of them governs one region in addition to his more or less specialized functions. The Togo Naba is in charge of 4 royal districts: Teziga, Sisamba, Sam Niaga, and Bis Sigai. The Togo Nabas basically come in turn from 3 families of commoners residing respectively at Toisai, Kierga, and Node. After the prime minister, in order of importance, comes the Rassam Naba or Bingo Naba, chief of the slaves of the crown. He is also the minister of finances, guardian of the treasury of precious objects, cowries, coin, bracelets, etc. He is the high executioner, when occasion arises, putting to death condemned criminals. He is chief of the blacksmiths and governs them through interposition of the Saba Naba. He governs the canton of Kindigai. Therefore, although himself a slave, the Rassam Naba rules over free men and holds power over full-fledged citizens. We will find the same practice among the Wolofs of Kayer Bayo and the Seriers of Sine Saloum in Senegal. The Balam Naba is 3rd in rank. He is mayor of the palace, in charge of introducing ambassadors and distinguished visitors. He administers the Sedinga, the Busu, and the Gursai. The Kidiranga Naba, head of the cavalry, comes from one of 3 ordinary Mosai families. The Rassam Naba always comes from the same slave family. Thus, the ministers who assist the emperor, rather than being members of the high nobility of the Nakomse, are systematically chosen from outside of it. from among the common people and the slaves. They represent at court, as we shall more clearly see, the different social categories, professions, and castes. Those without birth, slaves and laborers, organized into professions, castes, far from being kept separated from power in this period, which extends far back beyond the Occidental Middle Ages, since very likely it may go back to the 1st century and the foundation of Ghana, are associated with it, not in any symbolic but in an organic way. Each profession has its representatives within the government. They will, as needed, present its complaints. That is the spirit of this Constitution. In order to comprehend its originality, we would have to imagine at midpoint of the Middle Ages, 1352 to 53, the time of Ibn Battuta's voyage to the Sudan and of the 100 Years' War, not just some provincial lord, but the King of France or of England giving a share of his power, with a voice in decisions, to the rural serfs bound to the soil, the free peasants, the town guildsmen, and the merchants. And beyond all that, imagine the existence of a tradition according to which the king, within the framework of an already constitutional monarchy, cannot reign, cannot have morale and political authority in the eyes of the people, unless he is invested by a bourgeois who is also chosen from among one or few traditionally determined families. Neither the bourgeoisie nor the peasantry of the West would then have had the revolutionary virulence that once imbued them, and the course of Western European history would probably have been different. The non-absolute nature of the monarchy is revealed by the fact that, once invested, the ministers cannot be removed by the king. Below the ministers come servants of all categories, bureaucrats and military chiefs. The Samande Naba is the infantry general. He is not allowed to ride a horse, but at most only an ass, for since he is a slave, the horse is too noble a steed for him. However, in some cases, he may replace the Togo Naba, the prime minister. The Kam Naba is leader of the slave soldiers. He cannot command free soldiers. The Tam Naba is in charge of the sand of investiture. We will return to this ceremony in dealing with the coronation of the king. In its general lines, this is the structure of the council the emperor depends on in order to govern. All details concerning it are to be found in Torchier. Before analyzing any more deeply the political organization of the African states, we must briefly consider the principles of the Constitution of Cairo. Despite the historical, or rather geographic distance separating them, they appear to be a replica of those of the Maasai. The Constitution of Cairo. At the height of the power of Ghana, that is probably from the 3rd to the 10th century, tropical Africa as far as the Atlantic Ocean was ruled by it. Cairo was in all likelihood a former province of Ghana, which, in the 16th century, at the time when the author of the Tariq-es-Sudan was writing, had already become emancipated into an autonomous kingdom, independent of that of the Jolof, with a Damo at its head. The government council, which invested the king, was constituted as follows. Lamain Dimatil, Botul Ub Nidab Bari Gatenye, representatives of free men, men of caste or without caste, Gur, Ger, or Nino. Ili men of Ballet, Seringne of the village of Kab, representatives of the Muslim clergy, Diawergene and Bulgallo, Diarath Bunt Kur, representatives of the Tiedos and prisoners of the crown. The council was convened and presided over by the Diawergne and Diambur, hereditary representative of free men. The Tiedos comprised all the individuals attached to the king, whether as soldiers or courtiers. That at least is the meaning of the term retained at the end of the independence of Cayor, engineered by Faidherbe under Napoleon III. The Constitution was therefore in effect until 1870. This fact shows that African political constitutions had not appreciably changed with time. Only in the cases where the royal branch became Islamized do we see certain transformations. That was the case of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. The 7 Kayoran dynasties, to which we will return in discussing succession to the throne, never embraced Islam. It seems that one of the last demos of Cayor, Latjor Diop, the very one who had offered such determined resistance to Faidherbe, the symbol of national struggle in Senegal, converted to Islam for diplomatic reasons, in order to find new allies in Saloum, such as the Tukulor Marabout Maba Daiku and in Traraza. It was also customary to oppose the Taidos to the Domi Sokna. The latter were the constituent element of the Muslim clergy. They were separate from the traditional priest, and the two groups shared a reciprocal hatred and fought each other without mercy, for there was no possible common ground between them. The Domai Sakna had the characteristic of being most often members of the nobility. They came from the same social class as the aristocrats, but because of their conversion to Islam were despised and disowned by their blood brothers. It often happened that the latter, because of the matriarchy then in effect, would kidnap their daughters in order to give them in marriage to Teidos, thus, as they saw it, limiting the damage done. The Maasai and Kayoran constitutions reflect a political organization which must have been in effect since Ghana, and therefore probably dominated the African states for nearly 2,000 years. Actually, we have fewer details concerning the constitution of Ghana. Bakri relates that the king's interpreters were often chosen from among the Muslims, likewise the steward of the treasury and the majority of viziers. There is then every reason to believe that in 1067, at the time Bakri wrote, Islamization of Ghana, though still only very slight, had already influenced its political customs. The political constitution of Songhai, as it is revealed to us through the text of the Tariq-es-Sudan, which dates from the 16th century, shows an identical situation. The same must also have been true in Mali, and Ibn Khaldun gives the name of its first Islamized king, Burmandana. Matrilineal succession. Ghana, Mali. Within the framework of the rights governing succession to the throne and appointment of the various ministers, and functionaries of the empires. We can best sense the changes made in the constitutions as a result of foreign influences. In Ghana, the old African tradition was still strictly observed. Bakri is formal on the subject. Succession was matrilineal. Only the emperor and his heir apparent, his sister's son, were allowed to wear cut and sewn garments. In 1067, the sovereign of Bakri's time was the Tumka Menin, who had succeeded his maternal uncle, Bessi. Among this people, custom and rules demand that the successor to the king be his sister's son. For they say the sovereign can be sure that his nephew is indeed his sister's son. But nothing can assure him that the son he considers his own in actuality is. The custom of matrilineal succession can be accepted without necessarily attaching any importance to the justification given for it, although the latter seems convincing. This explanation, very often heard in Black Africa, considerably postdates the clanic conditions of economic life which gave birth to the matriarchy. Since the succession to the throne was so strictly regulated, one must suppose that the appointment of the various ministers had not yet become, as it would 5 centuries later in Shanghai, a purely administrative act, made practically without regard to tradition. Ghana was weakened by the Soso attacks. In 1242, the king of the exterior province of Mali would seize it. He was Sundiata Keita, one of the greatest of all the empire builders of Black Africa. Mali then would take the place of Ghana by subduing the Sosos. We know that Burmandana was the first of its kings to become Islamized. Ibn Khaldun gives some interesting details on the succession to the throne of Mali. It was still matrilineal. Mari Jata is line in Mandingo, Jat to ward off the line in Wolof, was the first powerful monarch of Mali. It was he who put down the turbulence of the Sosos and deprived them of any type of sovereignty. His son, Mensa Weli, succeeded him, then his brother Wati, and Khalifa, another brother. After the destruction of Ghana, there seems to have been a period of turmoil and political instability, during which the traditional rules of succession were temporarily disregarded. This is confirmed by the reign of Khalifa, an unworthy and bloody prince, who spent his time shooting at passerby with bow and arrow. The people, instead of challenging the monarchy, got rid of him by murdering him and returned to the traditional matrilineal rule of succession. Abu Bakr, the son of Mari Jata's daughter, succeeded to the throne. He was chosen king according to the principle of the barbaric nations, which placed the sister of the deceased monarch or that sister's son in possession of the throne. We did not learn the paternal genealogy of this prince. At his death by a freedman of the royal family, the usurper Sakura seized power. Ibn Battuta, in his voyage to the Sudan, gives precious information about imperial audiences in Mali. The king was assisted by several Fararis, each of whom maintained a small court of his own, in the manner of Mosai or Kayorian ministries. However, we have no details about the manner in which they were selected. The author, on the other hand, relates that civil inheritance on the level of the common people was matrilineal, and expresses surprise at having come across such a practice only among the blacks of Africa and India. He also informs us that the child bears the name of his maternal uncle, the one whose heir he is to be. The same method of inheritance thus applied in the case of both the common people and the aristocracy. Songhai, the Oriental influence. Songhai, which belongs to the last phase of the Islamization of the 16th century Africa, had political customs less embedded in tradition. They in every way resemble those which applied in the caliphates of Baghdad and the courts of the Arab Orient. The same endless intrigues took place around the throne. The Islamic Songhai seems to have recognized only the right of the primogeniture, but that was purely theoretical, for the eldest son, if not energetic or disadvantaged ever so little by circumstances, automatically lost his right to the throne, giving way to another son of the late Askia, or any other intriguing personage who succeeded in gaining the support of some influential high functionary. The right of the primogeniture was so fragile in the minds and consciences of the royal electors that it seemed normal automatically to disregard the eldest heir if he happened to be away at the time of the election. This was in no way a sanction against a son guilty of the crime of not assisting his father in his dying moments, as one might suppose. Upon the death of the Askia Daoud, the eldest of the sons who were at his bedside, El-Hajj took up his arms and mounted his horse as a sign of taking power, as he was more audacious and more energetic than his brothers, and all the courtiers feared him, for he knew how to counter their intrigues. They all acquiesced, even adding to his claims. They proclaimed him King Askia, adding that El-Hajj deserved power and would have been worthy to hold it even in Baghdad. El-Hajj, with his entourage, left for Kail, or Gail, the capital of the empire. An incident which occurred on the road as a result of the intrigues of one of his brothers, Hamed, allows us to form our own opinion of how they regarded the question of succession. One of the brothers of the new Askia addressed him in the following manner: "We admit only the right of primogeniture. If Mohammed Benken, the absent firstborn, had been present this day, the power would not have fallen to you." And Askia, deposed by his brother, did not have the right to take his sons into exile with him. They automatically went under the paternal authority of the victorious ruling brother and were in line to succeed him. That is the reason why the High Khoi, who stripped Askia Ishak II of the royal insignia after his defeat at Juder, pointed out to him that he did not have the right to take his sons with him. To which the Askia answered that he had not been defeated by an alien who was succeeding him, and not by a brother. The sons of Benkan were compelled to hide all through the reign of El-Hajj, for fear of being murdered as legitimate claimants to the throne. This would continue during the reign of Askia Muhammad Breno, and they would not be seen again until the interregnum which preceded the advent of Askia Ishak. It very often happened that a given courtier was responsible for a prince's accession to the throne. According to the Tariq es-Sudan, chapter 15, Askia Ismail was elevated to the throne by the Dendi Fari Martamzo on the very day his predecessor was deposed. And a Dendi Fari was merely the governor of a province. Succession to the throne could cause troubles, even in filial relations. Thus, Fari Manzo Musa revolted against his father. Askia el-Hajj Muhammad deposed him and took his place, after which he attempted to exterminate his brothers, a certain number of whom escaped to Tanderma and the protection of the Kormina Fari Atsman Ubado. Chapter 14. Brothers of the same father under the African system of polygamous life were social rivals and did not hesitate to eliminate one another when a matter as important as succession to the throne was involved. Askia Musa's struggle against his brothers was systematic and unmerciful, nor was this any longer an isolated case. It became the usual practice in Songhai. All the Askias except Askia Muhammad were sons of concubines, according to Kati, chapter 6, page 151. Whereas the reverse was true for the kings of Bara, which would explain the respect that the Askias showed them. The latter were compelled to consider the advice of the Bara Koi Mansa Kentade, whose mother was a slave, was the only one born of a concubine. The administrative organization and its extreme centralism will be described later on. However, we can note here and now that there were provincial governors of varying importance, such as the Farai, the Balama, etc. There were also governors of towns and of border marches, such as the Khoi, Manzo, Farba, etc. As against the custom enforced in Masai and Kiowa, the Askia appears to have appointed them arbitrarily. He might name to these important positions his son or any other person of his entourage. There was no shortage of intrigues among the candidates. There was often actual bargaining with the Askia, almost a contractual agreement. Make me the Balama, I will make you the Askia. Ishmael, at his accession, was obliged to give satisfaction to a courtier by giving him a higher position than the one he had hoped for. Army generals were no longer, as among the Masai and Wolofs chosen systematically from among slaves, it could be any kind of citizens, perhaps even nobles. After having suffered a defeat in the Kanta, Askia Mohammed bin Khan wanted to re-establish his prestige by attacking Gurma. To his utter disappointment, his general, Dan Kolko, completely absorbed in a game of chess, remained unaware of the proximity of the enemy who took the field. The king dismissed him, but the general asked for authorization first to name his own successor. The king appeared to give him satisfaction, but did not keep his promise. The spirit in which army chiefs and functionaries were appointed is thus made abundantly clear. Under the reign of Askia Daoud, Advent March 24th, 1549, the Kormina Fari el-Hajj revolted against the Askia. The Haikoi Bokar Chili Iji said to the king, "Appoint me to the office of Dandi Farai, and I promise to take El-Hadi and turn him over to you." And it was done. There was one characteristic object among the royal insignia of the Askias: the 10 torai, kindling wood in Songhai. It was supposed to be a dead ember from the first fire lit in the country by its first occupants. The members of this family transmitted this emblem from one generation to the next, thus making them the masters of the soil. What we have just said about the origins of the Askias shows that they were not the masters of the soil, but usurped this emblem in order themselves to embody the various attributed of sovereignty. The political customs of Songhai in every way recall those illustrated by the tragic end of the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, Hussein, who was murdered at Kerbala, Arabia. The custom even spread of cutting off the heads of defeated pretenders to the throne and bringing them to Laskia as a pledge of devotion. This was also the fate of the descendants of the prophets. Precedents in Songhai. Katai gives details of the greatest importance about the hierarchy of positions in Songhai under Askia Muhammad. The Degenia Koye, Generalissimo, commander of the vanguard, was the only one in the entire army entitled to sit on a rug during the audience with the king. He covered himself with flour instead of dust. The Kermina Farai, or Khan Farai, whose residence was at Tindurna, was a veritable viceroy. He did not have to take off his headgear or cover his head with dust. The Dendai Farai, governor of one of the most important provinces of the empire, the one bordering on Upper Dahomey, was the only one who could speak frankly to the king without fear. The Barakois alone had the right of veto. It will be recalled that all of them, with one exception, were born of noble women in contrast to the Askias, all of whom, with one exception, were sons of slaves, of concubines, according to the same author. The prince was obliged to heed their veto willy-nilly. One gets the impression that the Barakoi must have been the former legitimate masters of the soil from whom the Askias usurped the Tin Torai, the emblem of power of the earliest occupants of the land. The Dermakoi alone could enter the enclosure of the imperial palace on horseback. Only the Kadai could employ the servants of the king. He was entitled to a mat when he came visiting. The Gesiri Danke alone could question the king during an audience. Only a sharif could sit next to him on his platform. Eunuchs, an oriental custom introduced into Africa with Islam, stood to the left of the Askia, who rose only for scholars and returning pilgrims. The Askia ate only with sharifs, scholars, and their children, as well as with the San, even when these were very young. The latter, whose district in Timbuktu was San Kore, from which the university got its name, constitute the authentic noble class. It should be remembered that meals were eaten sitting on mats around one common platter. Katai attributes all these institutions to Askia Muhammad exclusively, as if they had not existed before his reign and survived him only partially. In reality, Katai and Sadai, being fervent believers, tend excessively to embellish the reign of Askia Muhammad and attribute to him even part of the glory of his predecessors. It is unlikely that institutions so entrenched and so detailed could be of so recent invention. The attributes of the Barakoi show that they reflect a tradition much older than the advent of the Askias. The explanation suggested by the author concerning these attributes merely confirms this point of view. The Barakoi who accompanied the Askia on the pilgrimage presumably took advantage of their presence together at the Kaaba to bind the Askia by an oath at the tomb of the Prophet. Promise me that henceforth you will abide by my counsel, whence the right of veto. I promise you, and so forth. The author was not able to show by what necessity the Askia, sovereign of all, voluntarily and so easily allowed himself to be bound by these oaths. It is notable that in Maasai country, where African tradition remained in effect, only one case of political conflict around succession to the throne is cited in the whole history of Maasai. Although it is longer than that of Songhai, that was the struggle of Tuguri against the Naba Ba Ogo in the 19th century, hence in very recent times at the end of Maasai history. The case of Kayora. The political situation in Kayora was halfway between that of Maasai and that of Songhai. All political positions below that of the king were hereditary. It was impossible arbitrarily to assign one to anyone who did not have a right to it by virtue of belonging to the corresponding caste. Unto Fade Herbe, the Badai Gatengses, the Botulab Endiabs, the Lemane Dimetils, etc., came exclusively from the same families. Apart from the competition between family members, there was no intrigue possible regarding these successions. The situation was different in the case of the king. At the end of Kayorian history, there were 7 dynasties of Garmis, or nobles, each with an equal right to the throne. All being of different origins, they were in perpetual rivalry. Unlucky claimants were frequently sent into exile. The Dijin was a common practice. This consisted of beating the tom-tom and calling out the name of the prince being banished and outlawed. He then emigrated to another more receptive kingdom. If circumstances were favorable, he could muster forces by buying slaves or getting some from the hospitable king. If he kept in contact with the dissidents in Kayora, if he established and sustained relations with the Diaraf and Diambor, who made and broke damos, his return to the throne might be assured. It often happened that in utmost secrecy, the Diaraf and Diambor sent for an exiled prince to place him on the throne, if the reigning king displeased the people. It seems that it was in this way that Mayao, one of the bravest princes of the Dorobi dynasty, ascended to the throne. Prior to the Kayorian monarchy, it seems the country was divided into landed estates belonging to the Serers. These native lords were called Lamanes, a term which means successor in Serer and Tukulor. The kings who, around the 14th century, consecrated this organization seem all to have come from outside. They were immigrant kings, rebellious, exiled, hunted princes, perhaps from Malai, Songhai, or Ghana, who had gone to seek their fortune in an outer province of the empire, and willingly led an uprising in it if necessary to gain control. It was common for members of the nobility, who had tasted power at home but lost it, to go and look for it elsewhere. The history of the Messina provides a typical example. One of the early kings of this country, Dejati, wanted to marry his brother's widow, who turned him down. He began to hate his other brother, Maghan, whom he believed responsible for her rejection. Maghan emigrated to the home of the Burkina Faso, the governor of the region situated north of the upper Senegal, Niger. He was welcomed and invited to settle wherever he wished within the province. In addition, he was recognized as a king of all those who had accompanied him into exile, instead of being treated as a prisoner by the Farai. Some other Pales of the Termez region, from which he came, soon joined him. Such, according to the Tariq es-Sudan, was the origin of the dynasty that reigned in the Messina, the territory chosen by Maghan. Generally speaking, these outside kings did not in any way modify the socio-political structure they found established in the area. We can then see why the less important traditions remained unchanged, while transformation occurred only at the royal level. And one can readily conceive that such kings could not be sacrosanct in the eyes of the people. There was no worship of them. They were just Tito's embodying brute force. They form a third category of African kings who must be distinguished from both the traditional kings who, with their people, retain their religion, Maasai, Moronabo, Yoruba, Alafin of Oyo, and the Islamized kings, Songhai, Futa Toro, Futa Jalin. Until the conquest of Senegal, the 7 Kayurian dynasties systematically refused to embrace the Islamic religion. Its followers were scorned and often mistreated. These dynasties were the Moyoi, Sogno, Ogadao, Gwelwar, Dorobi, Gwerj, and Bey. We know very little about the origin of the Moyos. The Sognos are considered to be Soses. The Ogadu dynasty was founded by Deti Fu and Diogo Fall. It was the very first. Its name brings to mind the cradle of Ghana. Its creator, says tradition, baptized it with this name in remembrance of his mother's native country. The Guerrilla were probably a Mandingo aristocracy who went to rule over the Serers of Sene Salem. A tradition common to the history of both countries tends to confirm this origin. We know with certainty that, according to the tradition, Suriata Keita, king of the Mandingo, has been helped by his sister to triumph over his enemies. In exchange for this service, he instituted a matrilineal succession in the royal branch. The present-day Guerrillas of Sene Salem also claimed that matrilineal filiation was introduced among them in the same circumstances. This was confirmed for me by a conversation I had with Fodi Diouf, head of the province of Salem and traditional king of this country, during his visit in Paris in 1956. As for the Dorobe, although they do not like to admit it, they seem originally to have been Peul or Tucular. Indeed, they presently exist among the Maasai in Upper Volta, Burkina Faso, a Peul clan called Tarombe. Also at Futa Toro, there is a Tucular clan of Tarobe, which supported Ousmane Dan Fodio. The Bey is merely a plural ending in Peul and in Tukulur. Tarombe, Tarobe, and Dorobe seem to be only variants of the same word derived from Toro. Moreover, the very names of the first ruling princes of this dynasty, Mao, for example, proved that they were Pales or Tukulur. The Dorobe is different from the other dynasties in that the king actually took command of his army instead of remaining at the rear and communicating orders. In defeat, he must die at the site. Members of the dynasty who survived a defeat were excluded from it, not in fact, at least in effect. Such was the case of Damel Madio Dio, who, starting in 1861, was defeated several times by Lat Dia without committing suicide, since he dared to survive a defeat. In the popular mind, he was no longer worthy of being a Dorobe. The Guerj came from the common people. They are distinguished by their adaptive ability and their military genius. The dynasty is named for the country of origin of the first founding Damel's mother. She was a commoner from the seacoast who married the king Guerj, meaning sea, in Wolof. Her son, though he had no right to the throne, succeeded in being crowned through his energy and mental agility. The Beys were in the beginning merely a good luck family, among whom pretenders to the throne went to select virgins. According to a curious tradition, it was enough to have contact with a virgin daughter of this family for one's chances of accession to the throne to increase seriously. The family then progressively became an integral part of royalty. As can be seen from the above, within each of these dynasties, succession to the throne was matrilineal. The dynastic founders remembered only their mothers or sisters, whose names were sacred. This was also true for the sons of Gango or Congo Musa. Gango Musa was one of the most powerful emperors of Mali, and Gango was the name of his mother according to Kati. Thus, it was the existence of several parallel rival dynasties that introduced so many problems into the succession to the throne of Cayor. Significance of royalty. The vitalist concept. The African universe was run in a strictly orderly manner, metaphysically speaking. The works of Marcel Griaule, Germain Dieterlen, and Father Temples revealed these fundamental ideas to the West. According to Temples, the universe was ruled by only one set of hierarchic forces. Every being, animate or inanimate, could occupy only a specific place according to his or its potential. These forces were cumulative. Thus, a living being who had as talisman the fang or claw of a lion, in which the vital force of the animal was concentrated, increased his own power by that much. In order to overcome him in battle, one had to have a sum of forces greater than his own, plus the lion's. Therefore, the struggle between two kings was, above all, a magic struggle on the level of these vital forces. It took place long before the physical combat in the arena, around the water jugs and libation stumps set up in the ground, during the night in the sacred groves. We can be sure that from the beginning of African history until the conquest by the West, each traditional king, before going into combat, indulged in these practices, and therefore firmly believed that victory was on his side. Islamation did not change this. it just displaced the center of interest. Instead of turning to the traditional priest who mediated between them and the hidden forces of the universe, the princes now went to the Muslim clergy, the marabouts, who practiced Eastern Kabbalah and gave them gree-grees to assure their victory. This metaphysics, far from constituting a minor fact in African historical sociology, was a predominant trait. If scientific explanation ignores it, all that it will grasp will be lifeless, external forms with no apparent logical connection. No one has revealed the internal logic of this African society better than Marcel Griaule, as has been pointed out by André Leroy-Gourhan and Jean Poirier. All work and human activities remind us of universal movement. Pottery, cattle breeding, dance, music, decoration, and particularly the prestigious art of the forge. The monitor was a blacksmith, the rhythm of the bellows and anvil of which inspired the first dance. The world is ordered like a vast equation. Human animation corresponds to the animation of nature, and each gesture extends back to its mythical precedents. The black African world, which seemed to some so simple, is simple indeed, but only because of its internal logic. It is very complicated in appearance. Creation takes on a sense that can be called philosophical. The black universe had seemed crude. It now turns out to be profoundly elaborate. Within the framework of this universal harmony, in which each being has its place, the king has a precise function, a definite role. He must be the one with the greatest vital force in the whole kingdom. Only in this way can he serve as mediator, he being sacrosanct with the superior universe, without creating any break, any catastrophic upheaval within the ontological forces. If he is not a legitimate king, fulfilling these exact conditions of established affiliation and appointed according to the rites of tradition, all of nature will be sterile. Drought will overtake the fields. Women will no longer bear children. Epidemics will strike the people. As long as the tradition was carried on in isolation from external influences, the king fulfilled a function in which no usurper could replace him. The obligations were strict, and the succession to the throne was practically without incident, as we have seen among the Maasai. The council, which convened to invest the king, Moro Naba, in reality examined the degree of legitimacy of the different claimants. It was not actually an election. The term is improper, for they were compelled, after a thorough, enlightened examination of each case, to appoint, not according to their preferences, but in accordance with tradition, the one who had all the requisite qualities. Among the same lines, when the level of vital force of even a legitimate king deceased, he was put to death, either actually, as was apparently the case in the beginning, or later on, with evolution symbolically. This was the general practice in Black Africa and ancient Egypt, where the symbolic execution coincided with the festival of Zed. By this means, the king was supposed to die and be born again, revitalized. He regained the vigor of his youth. He was once again fit to rule. This same practice is found among the Yoruba, Dagamba, Tachamba, Jukan, Igara, Shanghai, Wadai, the Hausa of the Gobir, Kasena, and Daura, the Shillaks among the Mbum, and Uganda, Rwanda, in what was ancient Moro. In Kayor, a king could not rule when wounded, probably because his vital force was thus decreased. In any case, it was said that it would bring bad luck to the people. The king and all of those who assumed high responsibilities, whether temporal or spiritual leaders, were considered mystically superior. Whence the Wolof expression "et bop," having more head in the metaphysical sense. That meant that those who might go against their will or who tried to contest their authority might go mad as a result. The king is truly guarantor of the ontological and therefore the terrestrial and social order. It is remarkable that not one African constitution provided for his replacement during the interregnum following his death for the maintenance of the maternal order. Whenever the throne was vacant, whatever the reason, social anarchy descended upon the people. Prisons were emptied among the Maasai without any representative of the law intervening to oppose it. The situation was identical, perhaps worse, in Shanghai, even though it was Islamized. The Tariq-es-Sudan reports that Askia el-Hajj, accession August 7, 1582, had Mohammed Ben Khan imprisoned at Kanato on the advice of Amr ben Ishik bir Askia. The three sons of Ben Khan, Bir, Kato, and Minda, stayed in hiding through the entire reign of El-Hajj and that of Bano, his successor. But they took advantage of the interregnum between the death of Bano and the accession of Askia Ishak II to come out of hiding with impunity and do everything they could to kill Amar, who was responsible for their misfortunes. The latter, warned in time, disguised himself in order to escape certain death, which would have gone unpunished. But he shed his disguise immediately after the crowning of the new Askia, for the disturbed situation having come to an end, no one could then commit an act of aggression against another. Most assuredly, in Shanghai, this was a vestige of a religious past, the death of which had not yet fully incorporated into the existing institutions. The ontological function of the king had not yet been forgotten. Under the Moroccan occupation, Pasha Ali bin Abdel el-Qadir, on June 19, 1632, launched a surprise attack on the city of Gao. He was defeated by the inhabitants, who seized his treasure and his wife. They also captured Prince Ben Khan, the descendant of the Askias who accompanied him. However, the latter was treated with much respect, and the people of Gao asked him to come and live amongst them, so they might thus obtain the blessings of heaven. Obligations of the king. The Fandoko Borhom, lord of the Messina, 1610, thought that any person invested with royal authority was the servant and shepherd of his people. Although the major figure of the country, the king, was therefore no less obliged to lead a life strictly regulated by custom. Among the Maasai, his schedule was planned down to the slightest details. The Moro Naba did not have the right to leave Ouagadougou, his capital, not because of royal pride, but because ritual forbade it. That is no longer true today, as traditions are beginning to fade. However, the Maasai emperor Nasiri, who laid siege to Ghana and fought against Sani Ali and Askia Muhammad, must have broken his rule because of the great danger which menaced his kingdom. Indeed, he is said to have directed in person the expedition against Ghana. It may also be that this tradition is recent and was instituted only at the height of the Mossad Empire. The life of the Kaya Magna of Ghana was as strictly governed by tradition as that of the Pharaoh of Egypt. Each morning, he rode around his capital on horseback, followed by his entire court, preceded by giraffes and elephants, according to Idrisi. Anyone who had a complaint could at that time address him and submit his case, which he settled on the spot. In the afternoon he traveled the same route alone, and no one was allowed to speak to him. These kings were sometimes so conscious of their role that they tried in every way to maintain contact with the people, to investigate grievances directly, so as to feel its political and social pulse, whatever the cost. Thus, the Moro Naba disguised himself at night and went through the lower-class neighborhoods of his capital in absolute anonymity, listening to conversations. So did certain damels of Cairo, but it must be recognized that they did this as a ruse, to sound out public opinion for personal reasons, to safeguard their power and prevent palace revolutions in this climate of dynastic rivalry. They had to keep constantly informed. However, the concept of royalty in Diara or Kaniaga in the Termes region, not far from Upper Senegal, was rather original. The king was obliged to remain in his palace and never leave it. He was surrounded by no pomp at all. Apparently, the people paid very little attention to him, not out of disdain, but because they felt as a king was great enough in himself not to need all these external signs of majesty. Its inhabitants were not Paols and harbored against the nomadic Paols a hatred typical of sedentary peoples. This kingdom was at first governed hereditarily by the Niakate or Diakate, then by the Dayawara. With his army of 2,000 horsemen, it was dependent first on Ghana, then on Mali. Inhabitants revolted and murdered the representative of Mali. But it cannot be affirmed that their concept of royalty grew out of that revolt. The traditional kings thus governed with minimal constraint except for such administrative abuses as were committed by civil servants, which would be discussed in Chapter 8. The tax system they established appeared not as exploitation, but as the part of one's goods and crops. That ritual decree must be turned over to the sacrosanct authority who linked the two worlds, so that order might be maintained in the universe and nature continue to be fruitful. Actually, the historical reality is less sublime. This almost divine order of things must have begun to degenerate from the very start. The description given above reflects an ideal situation which was not always realized because of the need for an administration dependent on an army of civil servants. But in either case, the evolution of the system never gave rise to a revolution. Ghana probably experienced the reign of a corrupt dynasty between the 6th and the 8th centuries. Kati tells of an extremely violent revolt of the masses against it. The members of that dynasty were systematically massacred. In order to wipe it out completely, the rebels went so far as to extract fetuses from the wombs of the women of the royal family. Yet, this did not constitute a revolution, for the monarchy itself was not eliminated. It was apparently not even seriously questioned. Filiation was matrilineal. The Emperor Kanisa I, contemporaneous with the Prophet Muhammad, 6th century, had chosen as his capital not Ghana but Karanga, the native city of his mother. The practice of matriarchy from the beginning in the royal succession is an important argument against those who support the theory that Ghana might have been founded by Semites, for the latter recognized only patrilineal filiation. Whatever our present attitude toward this metaphysics of social positions, this ontology, for more than 2,000 years, it ruled in an absolute manner the minds and consciences of our ancestors. It explains to a certain extent their failure or success when confronted with the task of civilization. This is why it cannot be too minor a factor in the historical explanation. We cannot fail to consider it. Separation of secular and religious.